Before the break, I talked to you how you assessed whether you met the escapement objectives in the postseason process. How do you, but that was only one small piece, so generally how does DFO go through its review of its management of the season against its management objectives? Like, what are the objectives that you're assessing against, and how do you do that analysis?
Most of the focus is on the key initiatives, or the significant initiatives that we might be undertaking in a given year. So over the last couple of years, Cultus is spawning is enumeration objectives, or the spawning ground objectives are the key, but the Cultus, I mentioned the earliest time, early summer, so conservation-oriented objectives in this case are key factors that we look for and see how effective we were with the different initiatives or changes that we've taken. On the fisheries side themselves, the First Nations meeting their needs is assessed. On the recreational, commercial, and then within the commercial, the splits on the domestic side of things, we have pre-season objectives for those. So, whether it's the 5% of the combined recreational commercial, or between seine, gillnet, troll, and the different license groups that they have. So all of that information is provided out, and where there might be issues that tend to be raised between the sector groups of things that they would like to change, then we'll take a look and see what we might do differently into the future.
Now, how do you assess whether you met the First Nations needs or objectives?
The communal licenses all have an allocation level on them, so in the different various areas, where the fish, did they catch the fish that are on the license amounts, and if they didn't, were there fish available that they might have been able to access those fish, whether for other reasons they may or may not have been able to.
And then do you create work plans in reaction to your assessment of whether you met the different objectives you just reviewed?
I'm not sure I'd use the term work plans, but what we tend to have is a running lists of issues that we're looking to try to resolve as we can, and somewhat on a priority basis. But if we need to be making adjustments in any given fishery or in our escapement objectives, they do vary between years. And in the case of the Fraser River Escapement Initiative, there's a number of issues that have been raised over the last couple of years in particular because of these two extreme low and extreme high return years that have created some discussion. So then we'll take a look and see what we can, the Frisbee modeling process, and we're looking to have workshops, things like that can try to address those issues.
Okay, and earlier you mentioned a couple of reports. The postseason treaty limit report, I think, was one. Is that right?
That's the Pacific Salmon Treaty report?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
I'm going to just take you to that. That's tab 2 in the binder, and it's CAN 032340. I might have too many zeros there. No zero at the end. Yeah. So 3234. And this is the 2009 postseason report for the PSC?
Yes.
And each country prepares a report like this?
That's correct.
Okay. And what's the function of this document?
Each country is obligated to report out against its allocations and limits and conditions of the treaty by each of the chapters. So in our case, this is Chapter 4, the sockeye pink chapter of the treaty, and so we need to report out on those. So we have escapement objectives, international sharing objectives, and we report some of our domestic information in this report as well.
Okay. And who prepares this report?
It's a series of people, as most things within the Department of Fisheries notions, and so there's a number of different authors bringing together for the Fraser sockeye pink. We will have a lead, and as it works its way through to the final, in the years since I've been the chair, Jeff and I tend to be the two people that have to review it and give it its final review to get back, and then it will be sent from Canada to the Pacific Salmon Commission, who then, this is the commission staff, who then will circulate it to each other's country.
Does it go through any level of approval or review after the two of you have completed your work? Does it go up the chain, so to speak?
Each of the sections, it's expected that the panel chairs will sign off on them. And so Jeff's shop is highly involved in coordination of the whole thing.
You sign off. Does the minister have to see this document or approve
No.
it before it goes? No. Are there any people external to DFO that review this before it goes to the panel process, or to the PSC, I guess?
Yes, there has been some people externally reviewing parts of this one, and I think a lot of that might be more related around this south one, and Jeff coordinates that. Maybe I should let Jeff do this.
Yeah, so we have in some years identified errors in certain spots in the document, and one of the ways we've tried to address that and address concerns is to identify people at the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee that have been interested in reviewing specific sections. So we give the report it's a relatively limited distribution, a handful of people that will, from the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, that will review and provide any advice or feedback on the report before it's finalized.
And then the next document that you referred to was the postseason report for 2009 Southern BC Fisheries, and I think that's in tab 16, and it's CAN 056738. Is that the document that you're referring to?
That's correct.
All right, can I just have that marked, please, to start?
Exhibit number 339.
Okay, now who prepares this document? Is it the same team?
Yeah, pretty much. And we were trying to reduce duplication and workloads, but also keep consistency of the information. So a number of the same people, but there are more domestic issues recorded in this report than there are in the international ones. So there are a few more people helping to bring the information together, but in this case, Jeff has the overall coordination and sign off to it at the end. But the sections, because they've gone through the same review in many cases as the Pacific Salmon Treaty report, we have somewhat similar reviews.
Is this report developed with any external assistance?
As Barry points out, the report is very similar and identical in places to the postseason report that's done for the salmon treaty. The southern sections are very similar, if not identical, to that report. We do remove the northern and transboundary fisheries here, and then we make additions for some fisheries not covered by the treaty, for example, Somas sockeye. And then, as Barry mentioned, some of the domestic considerations around Fraser sockeye, for example, would be added in. We don't do, or we haven't done a separate review externally on the southern version.
Right, and who receives this report?
This report's tabled at the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee meeting, and can also be tabled at our other consultation processes as well.
And do you ever get feedback from people who receive this report for requests for changes or updates?
We can certainly, and have had in the past, errors or omissions that have been identified in the report and that we've been asked to follow up on, but primarily it's a tool for people to look forward in their planning to see what some of the issues are that they'd like to see addressed in the coming year.
And does this document find its way up the chain? Does it go to the Regional Director General or the Minister?
This document does not go to the Minister, and it's circulated to others in the Department for Information.
Are summaries of either of these documents provided to the Minister? Is there a reporting in some way at the end of the season?
No, most of the issues that would be of concern or of interest to the Minister, if they've been identified, will have been briefed on separately. So we tend to take a more targeted approach on the specific issues that are going to be of interest or implication, or that the Minister will need to be briefed on, and we tend to brief separately on those.
Okay. And is this document used in any internal processes within DFO, aside from the IHPC process?
This document's got our reporting out on our various different objectives. It would be a reference material, I guess, to some of our internal meetings.
I mean,
Maybe I could just add, like, we use it in FRIMP to the Fraser River Integrated Management Team. I think it gets discussions occasionally at the Salmon Working Group, but from Fraser Sockeye Management, we're looking at this and our team and thinking about what it is that we want to look at moving forward. So it forms the basis of some of our discussions and planning for each of our sessions. Again, as Jeff pointed out, we often use it as a tool to help us move forward on a summary of the previous years, much more internally, but the record of management strategies used by the department often over a longer period of time.
Are there any specific decisions that are required of the department in the postseason process in terms of sort of management of the Fraser Sockeye?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the preparing these reports, making sure that people are informed, using that to help us move forward on our next season of management is the key objectives. The key sign-off types of things are done by fisheries regulations or that side of things in season.
I think those are the end of my questions for these two witnesses. Thank you.
Ms. Baker, now I just had a couple of questions that you might want to follow up on. And one is you may have said it, Mr. Rosenberg, but I may have missed it. In between the postseason process and starting the preseason management process, what activity is there between the Fraser River panel or between the DFO and the stakeholders? In other words, what goes on between the postseason, just describe the reports, and the preseason planning that generates discussion between the DFO or the Fraser River panel and the stakeholders?
Well, it's not a clear cutoff line that at one point you're in postseason, the next point you're in preseason. So so these processes are really iterative as they work their way through. As we had the postseason, the last in-season meeting in the Fraser panel, which was in this year, was October. With the data that we collected out of that, we held a Fraser Caucus and Fraser Integrated Management Team joint meeting in November to help us prep on some of our work planning coming into the next cycle year, to review some of our objectives, to look at where some of our issues were that we want to be thinking about in trying to prep in going into the January meeting. And so when we had the January Pacific Salmon Treaty meeting, which tends to be this 1 week long called postseason meeting each year, again, in prep for that one, on the Monday of that week, we got together as the Canadian Caucus and some FRIMP participation and the tech committee to prepare ourselves for that week in our postseason review. In this case, in the year we just went through, on the Thursday, as we ended some of our discussions with the U.S., we took the opportunity again to spend a few hours on trying to work on some things. We tend to have a meeting now looking forward on this cycle. We will hold a meeting, probably a conference call in late January or the first week of February, at least the week before the February planning session, and moving ourselves forward. And again, keep trying to narrow our list of issues or get all of our issues together that we want to be raising bilaterally or that we can work on domestically. We have that, which is really the start of the next planning cycle, supposedly for us in February, but we'll still be doing a lot of postseason accounting and review. We hold a meeting in April of the caucus FRIMP together, usually 1 or 2 days before we get together with the Fraser panel. Has 2 preseason planning meetings, one in April and usually one in June. So we'll take the opportunity to have a more in-depth session, usually in April, to try to make sure it links to our domestic planning, and often have more of a conference call in June. So they're sort of iterations. We try to link them close together, usually always trying to do our Canadian side of things. And then there's links because many of our domestic planning processes, whether it's the integrated planning team or the licensed area groups or even the First Nations groups, the Fraser panel participants are usually all on those other processes. That's where they came from or had the interest or got elected or represented from. So there's linkages there, and in most cases those individuals and myself or the other Canadian member of the panel have an awful lot of emails and phone calls, interactions that are going on a regular basis, like in the hundreds of exchanges in a given year.
I wonder if looking at Exhibit 318 might help as well to outline some of the meetings that take place in the fall and into the new year. Is that helpful as well?
That's our advisory process. I'm not certain if all the panel meetings are on there.
No, but I think also the Commissioner was asking how you engage the stakeholder groups in the postseason process as well.
Yeah, so this is a schedule we create and update a few times in a year about where all of our meetings are and how we try to link them together and who the key contact people are.
The other, it came up in Mr. Lapointe's evidence both last fall and more recently, but just assuming for the moment that a legal framework would permit the panel to make all decisions with respect to the fishery, not just in panel waters, but what are your views on the advantages or disadvantages of the panel having that kind of responsibility?
Well, there'd be many more things that the panel would have to meet and review on, and the system we have today, does allow us the flexibility to have, a number of iterations and back and forth domestically, in particular, thinking around a number of our First Nations fisheries and our First Nations food social ceremonial, as well as even the economic ones, where trying to get all of the timing and the linkages of all these fisheries. We always talk in the Lower Fraser, there's not enough days in the week, and if we could get 8 or 9, we might be able to get them all in. But trying to get all these fisheries lined up, if you had to get them where they're actually approved by the panel and come back for that sign off, I think that could be slow the process up in a number of ways. And from the U.S. side, I'm not certain that they have all the knowledge required, so there might be a fair bit of education side. Within the U.S. system, and this example of why this may or may not be an appropriate way to go, they have fisheries that they call ceremonial and subsistence, which is somewhat consistent with our food social ceremonial. Within their legal framework, they're allowed to have the tribes, as they call themselves down there, are allowed to sell all of their fish, but when there's not enough fish, like in 2009, they tend to hold their ceremonial and subsistence fisheries without panel approval, and that's okay. We understand they're doing that, and it tends to be for amounts of 1,000 to 3,000. In that year, I think they took 4,300 or 4,500 fish in total. And so it's spread out. They're for their ceremonies. They're for a funeral or something that needs to come up, and to try to be able to have a panel on standby for literally hundreds of licenses that could be issued in a year, but usually in the tens of licenses for special occasions. I think the panel would have a real struggle trying to operationalize all of that kind of a process. I think on the scheme of how we work today, both in the Canadian caucus and in the panel, is we have a lot of discussion about these fisheries, whether or not we're approving them. Every fishery it has some degree of discussion at the panel or in the caucus to make sure that people are aware and they're linking them, and that they're making decisions that are not inconsistent.
Mr. Groudon, Mr. Rosenberger, I have a few questions for you to explore in more detail. A couple of the topics that Ms. Baker asked you about, specifically preseason forecasting and consultation and advisory processes, which Mr. Commissioner asked you about as well. And then I've got a series of questions for you about DFO policies and initiatives and how they influence or are reflected in the management of Fraser sockeye fisheries. So starting with revisiting a couple of topics that you've spoken to, but the first of those being preseason forecasting. I'd ask that document number 1 on Canada's list, tab 1, that is, be brought up. It's a document titled Preseason Run Size Forecast for Fraser River Sockeye and Pink Salmon in 2009. The first bullet under the heading Summary sets out the median forecast for Fraser sockeye in 2009 and sets that median forecast at 10.6 million fish. This was the figure 10.6 million, as I recall, that attracted considerable attention through the 2009 fishing season. I note, and I'll ask you to elaborate on this in a second, but on the following page, page 2, the second bullet provides a bit of a caveat to that median forecast, highlighting the high uncertainty associated with these forecasts. Is this the key document with respect to the forecast, the preseason forecast that is for Fraser River sockeye in 2009?
It is. Yes.
And who prepares this document for DFO?
Sue Grant is the lead author, but there's 4 or 5 authors. They would be probably listed at the top of the document. So there's people bringing different expertise and whatnot into it. There is one external person that has been involved the last couple of years from the Pacific Salmon Commission, Kathleen Mickelson.
And Mr. Rosenberger, could you describe, if you're familiar with it, the review process for this document?
Until 2009, or in this particular document, there's a science review, which was formerly called the PSARC process, that reviewed the methodology and was affirmed in 2004, 2005, I believe. Actually, it's on the bottom of the way that's highlighted on the screen. So it's Cass et al. In 2006. Lays out the procedures for computing the various different models, and there's a large number of models that are available to each of the and not all available to each one of them, but the 19 stock groupings and then the miscellaneous populations have a different process. So in this case, Sue Grant, who's a stock assessment biologist from the Fraser area, produces this and has to follow that method. Did follow and has to follow that methodology so that it can get reviewed through the process and signed off for a given year.
And what use is made of this document?
That's key for us in preseason planning and also in our in-season works and understanding the linkages of timing, distribution, stocks of concern. So in this case, as it talks about in the summary part near the top of this page, where the vast majority of the fish coming back were summer runs, relatively small amounts into the other stock groupings. So it gives us that relative magnitude and understanding about which stocks we think we can harvest. In this case, it would have been summer runs, and then which stocks are more likely to be of concern, which were the other 3 stock groupings.
As is widely known, the actual total return of Fraser sockeye in 2009 fell far short of the 10.6 median forecast. Were there any stocks that exceeded their forecast in 2009?
Yes, the Harrison was substantially above expectations. Not certain I have the numbers. The forecast was around 69,000, and I believe we were in the 200,000 to 300,000 total return. So it was off, and not on the. We expected the large return in H4s versus H3s, as I described earlier. The Adams River return was 40,000, the normal, or the Adams Shuswap stock grouping, and I believe it was more in the 20,000 range, and the cultist stock, which ended up with a final fence count of around 950 adults from a brood year of 100, was probably fairly, well, in forecast-wise, and this one is high uncertainty. That might not have exceeded forecast, but it definitely exceeded most people's expectations. So there is some stocks, and most of them were in the late timing group.
I'd ask that this document be marked as the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 340.
Can I have pulled up tab 2 at Canada's list of documents? And Mr. Grubb and Mr. Rosenberger, there's a binder with these in hard copy before you.
Thank you.
This is a document titled Preseason Run Size Forecast for Fraser River Sockeye Salmon in 2010. This, as I understand it, is the 2010 version of the document that we were just looking at for 2009.
It's the same purpose to be the preseason forecast, but it's prepared significantly different in that this document sets out new methodology. In this case, they added 3 or 4 new models to be used in the, making the predictions and reviewing their accuracy. So, like the CAS 206 paper, this paper changes or adds to the methodology and had to go through a more rigorous science review, as well as bringing out the forecast information.
And Mr. Rosenberger, was this document prepared by Sue Grant and the other people that you mentioned earlier?
That's correct. I think there's 1 or 2 different authors between the 2 years.
Could you further describe the change in methodology? I appreciate that Ms. Grant will be a witness in the coming weeks, but just in general terms, and I'm trying to keep my questions to you at a very high level, given that you're just providing the overview, but could you describe, the change in methodology?
What Sue and others did was we'd been discussing through the 2009 year, even before the poor return, that we knew we were in a period of decreasing productivity, and it was largely because of discussions that went on around 2008, which at the time it had the lowest marine survivals that we'd had record for in the Fraser data set, and looking at trying to expand the range of models and options to be used in forecasting. And so in this case, there was models that were, they truncated the data set, so they used a portion of it. And so there's 4-year models, 8-year models, and Kalman filter models were added as options into those that could be used for making the predictions. And then in the review process, evaluating their effectiveness in time frames to what actually occurred.
Thank you. I guess before I leave it, could we mark that as the next exhibit? That's the 2010 run size forecast. One final question about preseason forecasting, and Mr. Commissioner is going to hear further evidence later in these hearings regarding the allocation of DFO resources. But I was wondering if you could provide, just in general terms, a sense of how many DFO resources, perhaps expressed as full-time employees or equivalents, are dedicated to preseason run size forecasting for Fraser sockeye.
In this case, with trying to develop new methodologies and reviewing, various other options that are available, there was considerable interaction between, in this case, DFO staff and a number of people from Simon Fraser University. So there's probably 8 or 10 people providing some information. There's 3 or 4 key authors from the department side, and we had significant support from Kathleen Mickelson, as I described in the 2009 one, as we moved into 2010. Dr. Randall Peterman from SFU and some of his people and some of the work he'd done on looking at different types of methodologies for forecasting and their accuracy and uses was considerable going into this. But we have people who are bringing the escapement side of the information, so our biologists that are coordinating and running the field operations, as well as intend to be the same people who are then evaluating that data that goes into these the data sets. So there's a lot of different people, but there's a few key authors, and I think in this case there was 4 or 5 key authors on this document for the transition.
A little bit more detail with you that you've already responded to questions from Ms. Baker about is sort of consultation advisory processes. And I'd ask that document number 3 on Canada's list of documents be brought up. These questions, I think, are perhaps better directed to you, Mr. Grout, but I invite Mr. Rosenberger to add to anything that you wish to say. You are, as you've expressed, the chair of the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, the IHPC as it's known?
That's correct, although at times in the past the salmon team lead has had that role as well.
The terms of reference date from May of 2005, but are they still reflective of current realities?
Yes, they are.
I'd like to take you to page 3. Near the bottom, I guess the formal name of this IHPC is the South Coast IHPC. That's the IHPC that deals with Fraser sockeye.
The IHPC usually meets together with both the northern and the southern reps in the same room. The south and north groups meet separately for the postseason review. So the meeting that Barry referred to that occurred this past week with the South Coast was just the South Coast IHPC.
Thank you. Under South Coast IHPC, there are listed the representations essentially for the various component parts. So 6 representatives for the CSAB, 3 for the SFAB, 2 for the MCC, that's the Marine Conservation Caucus, and 4 First Nation representatives, and 1 ex officio from the province of British Columbia. Is that still how the representation's working?
That's correct. The department has been doing some work around how we might improve the First Nations representatives in the process. We have had interest from a number of groups, First Nation groups, in increasing First Nation participation. And in fact, we've, for example, the Stalo we've invited an observer from that group to sit on the committee in the interim while we figure out a longer-term process for appointing representatives.
I might just add to that one that participate or attend, who attend as observers, somewhat as Jeff described, although that one is more formalized in what they're doing. But there are a number of other people who attend, most of them First Nations, but they make it clear they're not representatives. They're, I think, really trying to understand the process and to what degree they might want to engage and how.
Thank you. I'd like to bring you back to that point because I note in the terms of reference, as you've noted, I'm sure, after the phrase for First Nations representatives, there is a note, and it says in 2004, interim appointments by DFO will be based on recommendations made by major Aboriginal groups active in the South. For longer-term appointments, DFO will continue to work with Aboriginal groups to identify a suitable process. And Mr. Grout's alluded, I think, to that process, but could you describe it in more detail? What's happened since this, perhaps, and what work is ongoing?
I could try to answer that. So we have we started the First Nations Forum on Conservation Harvest Planning about 4 years ago, bringing together the Southern Approach First Nations groups with all those within the Fraser, and in getting that process off the ground, we ended up forming a group to try to manage the process, so a combination of First Nations and DFO people. That steering committee, if you would, has now broken away into a group that's trying to build a longer-term process that we can agree on collectively, that would have people, defined as representatives in this process, or to the Civic Salmon Treaty processes or whatever, and as well as linkages between the forum and sub-regional groups and domestic issues and things like that. So that's our objective, is working on that, and some people have referred to it as the roadmap process.
I'd ask, well, perhaps before I do that, I'll just ask that the terms of reference for the IHPC be marked as the next exhibit. And then I'd ask that Exhibit 289 be brought up. Mr. Rosenberger, you described the roadmap, I should say, work. This is a document that's already been entered as an exhibit. Is this reflective of that work that you described?
That's one part of it, yes.
Could you describe what else is involved and how that's going to improve the IHPC representation from First Nations?
So the overall objective is to try to jointly develop our approved upon consultation co-management process between First Nations affecting Fraser stocks and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So there has been at time lists of different issues put together. So what do you do about a decision on who gets the fish in a given location versus a policy is being developed. So the idea there is that there's a range of kinds of issues that could come forward, and you're trying to match that with where do they fit in the process. So what's a regional initiative, what's a watershed type of initiative, what's a sub region and versus a much more localized process, and how do the First Nations see themselves as amalgamating. So we have a funding and strategy process called the Aboriginal Resource, it's ARM. What does it stand for? I lost it.
Aboriginal Aquatic and
Yes.
Oceans Resource Management.
Thank you. So we have, so that's a key that's helping to facilitate these types of developments of overall process. So one of the kinds of things that the department is bringing to this is that we would like to see representative people appointed to programs or to like the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee or to Fraser Panel or to whatever, so that promoting that there's responsibilities of taking information back, seeking input, clarifying what's required, as opposed to somebody being there as an individual who really then can only state that they represent themselves. So that's the longer term objective here that we're trying to develop.
Thank you.
Maybe, Hugh, I wouldn't mind adding one point just related to the First Nation process. I don't think it's been made before, but the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee is not intended to be the body where negotiation of food, social, and ceremonial fisheries occurs. What we're trying to do there is to improve the coordination of the different fishing plans, and to the extent that the First Nation participants can identify issues that may affect fishing plans for themselves and for others. That's one of the intentions of the group. I have been talking with the current representatives at the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee over the past year about ways we might improve the representation there, and we don't have a clear process laid out at this point. I think it's one of the topics that may be discussed at the First Nation Fisheries Council, but there is an interest in making sure that there's active participation into the group and a recognition of the value of participation there.
Thank you. Could you describe, in general terms, some of the contributions that have been made by, and I'll walk you through it, I guess, First Nations participants in the IHPC process in terms of changes to the IFMP or improvements to the management of Fraser River sockeye fisheries?
Well, I think there's been lots of improvements and changes, and the IHPC is probably not the key place where some of that's gone on. But from within First Nations fisheries and the IFMP development, the Integrated Fisheries Management Framework, back before around 1990-92, each individual First Nations was licensed separately and pretty much to go fishing wherever they wanted to. The department, working with the First Nations groups, have developed what's referred to as often band licensing, but it may be much larger than a given First Nation. It could be groups of First Nations. And those groups of First Nations have taken over the management, in this case, so it's co-management process within a given area. So they define who gets to be the participants, what types of gear should be used, when fisheries should be occurring, that kind of thing, so that they're the ones that are defining the management within that given area within an agreed upon objective, which is potentially a number of fish, or the number of fish on the communal license, or a weekly expectation, things like that. And so it's that's moved forward in the joint data management collection, so the catch monitoring programs. In some cases there has been at times joint enforcement programs. Much less familiar with those, but in years gone by there was some. And then moving forward, with the processes, we created this, what was for a while a watershed agreement, and we're trying to expand into the broader forum process. So getting more explicit input into escapement objectives, understanding their needs by some of the individual stocks and stock groupings and actions that we might want to take and collectively work towards. So it's fairly well developed now, but there's lots more we would like to do here and moving forward and trying to get that as a established process.
I'd like to ask you the same question with respect to the other participants and the other sectors that participate in the IHPC process. So same question essentially with respect to the commercial sector, the CSAB. What contributions have they made through their input to improvements in the management of Fraser River sockeye fisheries?
Somewhat. Everybody's contributing to some of the same places, but as you get into these processes, you get a much clearer understanding about individual groups' objectives. So they've created a vision document, I believe is the title for it, but so getting a clear idea about their longer term objectives. So again, they're inputting into escapement goals, objectives, harvest rates, and so how do they fit, and then also in their case within the maximum 5% commercial sport sharing arrangement that occurs. So how do they see that occurring? In this case, they don't like we're closed, we're open, we're closed, we're open every other day that a commercial fishery might go through. So how do you ensure that you're trying to meet their opportunity type of objectives, and less sometimes focused on a number, but if you're thinking you're going to bump up against the number, what can you do? So the interactions, like they helping to define, should it be, you know, a 2-a-day limit or 1-a-day limit or closed somewhere, those kinds of things. We've done a number of joint studies together. They've helped to define some of our release mortality studies that we were using from another area that may not have been appropriate, and they've given us advice on what they would like to see, so we work on some of that kind of stuff together. So I think it's overall improvement to be more selective, being more individual stock or species orientated.
Maybe just to add, Hugh, to what Barry said, the groups are able to come to the IHPC and put on the table issues that I think are regional in nature and that affect potentially the fishing plans of others. We have seen, to give specific examples for Fraser sockeye, in 2006, the IHPC struck a subcommittee dealing with the appropriate management response for Cultus Lake sockeye. And so there we saw a development of the committee where each of the groups from the IHPC were represented to try and find a way forward to propose some options that would provide for the recovery of Cultus sockeye, but also provide for fishing opportunities for some of the various different groups. So that's one example that we can maybe get into some more detail on. The commercial and the recreational groups have also worked with each other in an allocation implementation committee, which is focused on how the allocation policy itself is operationalized. And one of the issues around sockeye in particular is the providing stable opportunities for the recreational fishery, but recognizing that sockeye, pink and chum are the primary source of harvest for the commercial fishery. So the allocation policy refers to a 5% cap on the recreational fishery over time. And certainly in some recent years, the recreational fishery itself has been over on an individual year, but not necessarily over time. So that's been one of the issues that the sectors themselves have worked closely on trying to figure out responses to specific issues.
We'll take the break now. Thank you.
Hearing a recess for 15 minutes.